You ready? Oh, and the lights go down. Okay. Again, thank you everybody for coming out. My name is Chris Nichols. I'm an amateur historian of the area. I was born here in Garrett County, moved around growing up a lot, and then moved back here about 20 years ago, and I have no intentions of going anywhere now that I'm back. So I really love the area, and I really love sharing some of the special things about it with other people who are willing to listen. So we got some people here who are willing to listen. So what I'll be talking about tonight is the history of the general Deep Creek Basin area before there was a lake. So we'll go way back and kind of look at indigenous peoples, but really focus on a period of about from the early 1800s through 1925, when the lake was officially formed and the power plant switched on, and that's kind of the birthday of the lake. So what was it like around here before it became a lake? So there was a deep creek, that is the namesake of the lake. It's not really clear when that was actually named. They just kind of started appearing on maps as Deep Creek, or who actually named it. But the earliest mentions I've seen, written mentions I've seen, is from the McHenry family letters that we'll talk about. And the very earliest mention I've seen of the words Deep Creek was 1818. So we can kind of consider that as the first naming of the lake. And we'll go through a lot of these great sources of what it was like around here back then. The McHenry family was kind of the first source that I found that really provided a lot of description of what the area was like. And we'll look at all these different sources. But surprisingly, there were a lot of visitors to this area. And we'll see that a lot of people were visiting here, enjoying this area, well before there was a Deep Creek Lake. It was indeed deep. And if you are kind of an explorer of the local streams around here, that's somewhat unique in that, a lot of the smaller streams are kind of ankle deep, most spots. This was about 3 to 4 feet deep, kind of in the main course of it. So around McHenry, it was about 3 to 4 feet deep. This whole general area, so all of the drainage area generally of Deep Creek, was referred to as the Glades. So if you hear me talking about people living in the Glades, or if you hear some of those historical references of the Glades, that's generally what people talked about this area, the central part of the Garrett County area, as the Glades. Looking kind of generally where today's 219 bridge is, that area was kind of a marshy, swampy area. We'll see that in some of the maps. Then as it flows down to where it meets the Youghiogheny River, it got a lot more rocky and had a lot more of a cliff-type shoreline with the rhododendron and mountain laurel growing on both sides. So it started as this kind of meandering, wide and deep creek through the marshy area. And then as it got close to the Yough, it gets real rocky and kind of cut into the cliffs there as it meets the main river. The main area, so kind of the big area of the lake right now, that was already a seasonal lake. It would get inundated when there was a big snow melt or a big rain. It would turn into maybe a pond more than a lake, but it would inundate and flood, and it was navigable as a lake at that point, even before there was a dam. And it was already a sportsman's paradise. So people in the early 1800s were coming here specifically to enjoy the natural resource recreation of Deep Creek. They were coming for hunting, they were coming for fishing, and just for the general beauty and tranquility of the area, even in the early 1800s. But, we'll see that there wasn't really a lot of permanent settlement in the area. I think some of the, just Garrett County in general was very slow to develop and become very populated. And this central area that we refer to as the Glades was kind of a very sleepy area. We had that big marshy area that we're talking about in the middle of the lake that kind of precluded anyone from building a lot of permanent structures. So it really took a long time, even before the lake, for a lot of housing and people, to start settle here. But there were, interestingly, 2 dams built on Deep Creek before the current one. And we'll talk about those dams and the little lakes that they formed before the current one. But I think it's important to acknowledge that before white European settlers came, this was an area that was used and settled by indigenous peoples. And it's not always clear exactly. They didn't have maps and boundaries and statehoods and all of that. So it wasn't clear exactly, and their concept of ownership was a lot different. But a lot of people were using these lands before the European settlers came. And due to the weather, it seems that they were not likely permanent settlements, so there seemed to be a lot of seasonal hunting camps. So on this map, you can see the green triangles are either speculated or places where we have some archaeological evidence that indigenous peoples had some form of a camp or settlement. A lot of these were seasonal hunting camps. There is some evidence of some farming that happened at these, but largely it doesn't seem that there was a lot of long-term permanent structures or settlements created by the indigenous peoples. But the red are all of the speculated trails that they used. And you can see one interesting thing of interest to us for the lake is that, it didn't cross where we're going to see a lot of the bridges crossing the lake there. They crossed here at the Narrows, which is that real rocky spot that, you could kind of imagine skipping from rock to rock to get across what was a deep, fairly fast-flowing creek at that point. But another interesting thing to note about the indigenous people's presence is that we don't have a lot left from it. So a lot of places up and down the East Coast, you see a lot of these indigenous people's names of places persist. And really just kind of thinking about it briefly, the only three things I could think of in Garrett County that still retain those original names are the two big rivers that we have, the Potomac and the Youghiogheny, and then Buffalo Marsh, which I'll talk about where that name came from. But those are the only real three big things that I could think of that still retain the indigenous people's presence. They just didn't have a big footprint here before the European settlers kind of drove them out completely in the late 1700s. This map is from 1901. It's a 1901 topographical map, so of course before the lake was formed. And you can see here, I cut it off a little bit, but the headwaters of Deep Creek down here at the south, flowing kind of that horseshoe direction, and then emptying into the Youghiogheny here. That's flowing north. And you see the main area, and you can also even see the general outline of especially the main body of the lake there. But as I was saying, it was very marshy. This area was subject to being inundated when it would rain or have heavy snowmelts. We've got, kind of cuts that off, Buffalo Marsh up here. And that was another one of the indigenous people's presence. There was legends that they would drive herds of buffalo into this marsh, and some of the buffalo would get stuck in the marsh and become easy victims for the indigenous peoples to hunt them. So that's one of the origins of why that's called Buffalo Marsh there, is that was a hunting technique by the indigenous peoples back then. And that's when there were still buffalo in this area, and those were largely driven out when the European settlers kind of pushed everything to the west. Some other interesting features on this, just geographically, is you can kind of see the more flat and open areas here in the southern part of the lake, and then it gets into that more of a canyon type of terrain as we get closer to the Yaak. And we'll see some interesting things that happen in that terrain when, before the lake is flooded, and then afterwards, some of the ways that topography plays a role later on. So we're kind of at the point right now where European settlers are starting to come in. There was some prohibitions on that the King of England had set that settlers weren't allowed to go past a certain point for fear of provoking the indigenous population. Those were removed after the Revolutionary War, and now the state of Maryland, had this new state to fill up with people. Part of the strategy of the new state of Maryland was to give away lots of land in exchange for service for Revolutionary War soldiers. So the state of Maryland gave away every effective recruit is to receive, besides the Continental allowances, a bounty of $40, a pair of shoes, a pair of stockings, and at the expiration of his term, provided he shall not desert from the army, 50 acres of land to be procured and laid off as forehead to him or his representative. On the left, we see all of those, many of those 50-acre lots. These are all these little squares that were laid out in the late 1700s by a surveyor. All the other weird things in here are things that were already claimed by other people who had, quote, patented pieces of land. So they had already claimed a lot of these other pieces of land, but the surveyor set out all of these 50-acre lots. But the plan did not really work out as the state of Maryland intended. There's not really any evidence that any veteran actually claimed their lot. And they instead sold them to speculators down in Annapolis and Baltimore who kind of repackaged them and resold them. And eventually people got interested in coming out here. But right after the Revolutionary War, people were it was still kind of the hinterlands, very difficult to access. The weather, the winters were rough. So there really was no evidence that actually came to fruition. But I projected the current outline of Deep Creek Lake onto the military lots here. And you can see some very interesting things of today's names. So we have this whole area where we have everything's Paradise, Paradise Point and Paradise Heights. And this patented piece of land was called Addition to Eden's Paradise Regained. So you see some of the origins of the developments and the housing areas. If you live kind of out in this area, there's an area called the Gleanings. And it's a little cut off there, but you can see some of those areas that got their names from these original land patents. And, they had some really fantastical names. The first part of the Rights of Man. If you think about today's development names, it's like Pine View or, Greenscape. So I wish they kept some of these really exciting names in today's developments. And if you track back, many of you, if you have, lake area or even anything in the county, if you track back your deed, it will very likely reference one of these military lots. So if you track your deed back all the way to the late 1700s, early 1800s, it will reference that this military lot is, one of the pieces of land that was formed what you have today. So moving now to what some of the earliest records we have of Deep Creek, and these are from Colonel James McHenry. He was an aide to General Washington during the Revolutionary War, served as the Secretary of War, 1796 to 1800, and then he kind of had some health problems, so he retired from public life and moved largely to what would become Garrett County. He acquired about 1,000 acres of lands. We saw some of those in that previous slide called Locust Tree Bottom, the Buffalo Marsh area, and Wild Cherry Tree Meadows. Those were all those big tracts of patented land. He started buying them up, started settling his family here seasonally. He still had to go back to, as a lot of us know, you still have to go back to the city to do business, and then you can come back here and enjoy yourself. And that's largely what the goal of his life was to enjoy this area and the peacefulness of it, but then deal with business in the city as he had to. His nephew really was the one who kind of became the big quote-unquote developer of what would become the town of McHenry. His nephew John McHenry was a lawyer, but he eschewed kind of the big city lawyer lifestyle. He was well regarded as a lawyer in Baltimore, but he moved up here full time and really established a kind of big homestead for the family, and that is almost exactly where today's Lake Point Inn is, very likely where their log house was back then. And Dr. McHenry, James McHenry, was, I think, the original promoter of how great this area is. And I'll just read this quote because I like it so much. "I like this country, its salubrious air, its mild summers, its interesting views made up of hills, woods, glades, streams, and mountains. Above all, it delights me as affording at my time of life a salutary retirement from the busy world and its cares. I do not feel therefore disposed to wander further or to quit it in a hurry. Indeed, did it quadrate with the interest of the whole of my family to fix here, I should never move from the spot I am on now." So I think this should be on the cover of every one of our visitor guides. This really sums up what we all love about this area. And he wrote that in 1812, and that was to the Honorable Thomas Johnson, who was the governor of Maryland at the time. Moving now into John McHenry, his nephew. John was the one who kind of really developed the homestead and had a lot of visitors and was renowned as the person to visit in the Glades area if you were, kind of visiting here. He talks about Deep Creek, and I won't read all of these, but, he talks about people visiting from Deep Creek from the Selby's Port, which is around Friendsville now. Selby's Port was flooded in the Youghiogheny River Lake, and the neighboring county in Virginia, which would be West Virginia today. But they caught, over the course of 3 days, 700 trout. So just, rod and line fishing out of Deep Creek, 700 trout. And then in this second excerpt, he's describing the area and its beauty. And I will read the last line here. He's describing a country almost unoccupied, no peculiar customs, prejudices, or manners that a new settler is obligated to accommodate himself, except treating the original settlers with kindness and civility. So I hope we can all live up to that, too, as well. Thank you. Yes. So great words. Great appreciation of this area, and that this was in 1818, and I think that still rings true today. The next person we're going to talk about is James Shriver. He was an engineer who was tasked with finding a route to continue the C&O Canal past Cumberland. So the ultimate goal was to get that canal, to get it out to eventually the Ohio River, out to the Mississippi, and then down to the Gulf of Mexico, and you could create this big circular trade route. Obviously, that did not happen. The railroads superseded the efficiency of the canal, but that's not for saying that a big government project didn't get a lot of people excited about, let's try and see how we can spend all this money. So he was tasked with, he was an engineer to try and find a route to get from Cumberland to some point west. George Washington was very excited about this idea. He actually took a couple of bushwhacking expeditions to kind of see what this route might be. And you've got a little bit of a weird oriented map here, but here's Garrett County. Got Cumberland right here. And the general plan was to continue up the Potomac to around Westernport, kind of do a tunnel, maybe follow the Crabtree Creek there. That wasn't very clear. But the big crux that we're worried about of this plan was to dam Deep Creek. So we've got Deep Creek right here going through the center of the county. He had a plan to dam Deep Creek, create a navigable waterway there that, once you kind of made it past this mysterious point, you'd be able to float your canal boats here. And then there wasn't a lot of clarity on what you do past here. Again, this is pretty rough terrain. The Yacht isn't really navigable here. But the important thing is here, he did a really detailed survey of the Deep Creek Basin with this plan to flood it and float the canal boats through there. And zooming in on that map, he really had a lot of interesting, intriguing details of what it was like here in 1824 when he did this survey. So we've got a little bit of weird orientation again. This is north. Normally north would be kind of pointing up here. But we've got the course of Deep Creek. Going through here, we've got some of the familiar stuff of the Narrows. That's about the site of the current Glendale Bridge. Generally crossing the Deep Creek about where 219 does today, maybe a little bit further north is today's current location. But one interesting thing that I saw on this map is the falls of Deep Creek. So here's the Youghiogheny River. He notes Swallow Falls. I always am disappointed that Muddy Creek Falls just is never really called out. Everyone loves Swallow Falls. Muddy Creek Falls is the big one. But he notes a falls of Deep Creek. I'd never seen anything about that before, and I'd never seen any references to that since. So we'll talk a little bit about these mysterious falls here. But again, a very detailed survey. He calls out John McHenry's, which he visited and spent some days at McHenry's there. Another inn was Ingman's Inn along this. This was a major road kind of traversing the area. And some other interesting features pre-lake there. So Shriver describes the area of the lake, and he has a very good physical description. It has a width of 15 to 20 feet, a depth of about 3 to 4 feet. He describes the inundation area. He was mainly concerned about how navigable this would be if they flooded it. He also describes an interesting natural feature near the residence of the McHenrys, which was boiling springs. So just the way the water came, a natural spring came through the rock, it created like a very mild boiling phenomenon. But that has since been covered up by the lake, so that's not something we can see. I don't even think it would have been strong enough to even see coming out of the lake today. So that was one of the things that we kind of lost when the lake was flooded. But here he describes those falls of Deep Creek. And I'm not going to read all of this, but the first part of this paragraph describes, some very nice falls, the features of that. But then he describes this really interesting sounding natural feature. I will read a rocky bank of near 100 feet in height, and the visitor, on raising his eye, sees that the summit of this terrific pile is seen completely overhanging him. A glance at its water-worn and loosely connected base so strongly induces the belief that the mass above him is tottering to its fall, that he is involuntarily impelled to hasten his steps onward to avoid the apparent danger. The rude character of this pile has given it the name of the Devil's Castle. So what a cool sounding feature. I was very intrigued by this. Right around this spot where he notes that the Falls of Deep Creek are. Again, have never seen any reference to this before or after. This is the only kind of written historical reference I've seen for the Falls and Devil's Castle. And we'll find out later what the ultimate fate of those are. But I do love the prose on this. This is a technical report, and he's really, it's more of like a travel log. It's like the Lonely Planet for Deep Creek Lake. So shortly after I had written a blog post kind of finding these results, I had a reader send in this postcard. And on the back, it says, Falls of Deep Creek, 1909. So now I kind of know, all right, this Shriver guy wasn't just making it up or exaggerating. These are some legitimate falls that are, fairly big, nice and scenic. And that further piqued my interest to see if I could find these or just see if there was any evidence of where they were, if they had been covered up by the lake. And we'll look at that a little later of whether they're still there. But let's go back to some of these more contemporary looks at the lake. Another visitor to the lake to the Deep Creek, the Glades area, in 1824 was a guy named F.G. Skinner. And he was, I guess, probably the nearest analog today would be a sports writer, sports and hunting writer. He published a publication out in New York City that was, sports and hunting expeditions that he did all around the world. And, I think his family helped him pay for a lot of that. But it was a well-regarded publication, well-read. And he spent about a month here with a Scotsman named Campbell in 1824. So that same area that Shriver was here visiting, Skinner was also in the area. And he writes a nice description of what Deep Creek was like, talking about how it runs sluggishly between steep banks. It's about 3 to 5 feet in height. But his focus is on the hunting. So he says that the tall growth of grass is that any fowler can approach the stream from anywhere and get their ducks within half a range of number 6 shot. So his focus was on the great hunting in this area, and much of his account describes their great expeditions. They went out and hunted ducks. They hunted other waterfowl, deer hunting, bear hunting. He really enjoyed himself here a lot. He was also visiting John McHenry's homestead and was treated to a delicious dinner. His gift of hyperbole here is pretty incredible. He's describing the trout that he had, and he said, "I here do most positively assert that never, anywhere, at any time, have I eaten anything to compare with those fat, flaky, salmon-colored Deep Creek trout cooked en papilite." That's in paper. But yeah, this guy has traveled the world, done these hunting expeditions all around the world, and he's waxing rhapsodically about how great the trout were out of Deep Creek. So I thought that was a very telling indication of the quality of the fishing, and the fact that those fish were so good and so fat and flaky. And of course, now we come to Meshach Browning too. So one of my personal historical interest. If you're not familiar with him, he wrote a book called 44 Years of the Life of a Hunter. He was one of the original European settlers of the area in the early 1800s. He and his wife had several homesteads, right around this area. So one is within a mile of this spot. One was down on Sang Run near the Youghiogheny. And the book is mainly hunting stories of him. He supposedly killed over 500 deer, hundreds of bear, panthers, wolves, snakes. And I believe that most of it is true, but there is a lot of exaggeration in his stories. But adding to that, he also had a lot of great descriptions of the area, of what life was like at the time, and obviously a great admirer of nature and the beauty of this area. And he also mentions visiting the McHenrys, visiting Campbell, because they were his neighbors here. They were both within about 5 miles, and those were the closest neighbors at that point. So that gives you an idea of how spread out and how sparsely populated this area was when there were really 3 families that lived here, the McHenrys, the Brownings, and the Campbells, and they were only 5 miles within each other. He describes the Glades and kind of generally defines it as the area between Backbone Mountain, the Youghiogheny. You've got the Savage River, Hoopoe Ridge on the south, and then kind of trailing off to the north, probably what would be today's Bear Creek area, and describes them as clear level meadows covered with high grass and kind of a good rye, which we know later was used for distilling an accident. So that was kind of a good local crop of rye that grew here as well. He describes a lot of fishing in Deep Creek. He was a big fan of going to fishing at Deep Creek, and he describes talking about as fast as he could bait his hook and let it into the water, he pulled out the largest kind of trout. And this was just during a day, and he counted 47 trout, and he just got tired of fishing at that point. He couldn't carry anymore. So it was just that plentiful and that easy to fish for trout that that was the level of fishing he got. And again, some more things about, from Browning's account, he talked about his wife Mary asked him to catch a mess of fish for breakfast, and he went to Deep Creek where success was certain. And he talks about his now fairly unethical practice of spotlight hunting for deer, but he did it by canoe on Deep Creek. So he had a canoe that he rigged up with a lantern that had a little shutter on it, and he would float down there. And if you don't know, deer get kind of transfixed if they see light at night. So now with our modern lights and technology, it's fairly unethical to go out and make a deer freeze and then shoot it. But he had a little less advantage back then. So he would float down the creek, float down Deep Creek with his little spotlight lantern, wait to spotlight, transfix a deer, and then shoot it as he was floating by. So you get both an idea of how navigable Deep Creek was at that point and how remote and nothing else was going on if there were deer just kind of hanging around the banks, and he was able to kind of shoot them at will there. Looking forward a little bit more to 1886. So after that heyday of all these accounts of Browning and Skinner and Shriver and McHenry, really we don't see a lot of accounts of the area past then. So from that 1824 to 1850, there's not a lot of talk about the Glades. There's not a lot of talk about Central Garrett County. There's not a lot of talk, Central Garrett County doesn't even exist at that point. Not a lot of talk about Deep Creek. And it really does seem that this area just kind of fell off the map. This is a map from 1886, and we're kind of focusing in on the Deep Creek Valley. This particular map, has Green Glade, as starting here, but most of us would recognize that Deep Creek kind of goes all the way down and down that way. But you see some structures here. All little squares are structures. So at this point, McHenry does have a post office based on the homestead and settlement of John McHenry, and some other little buildings there. We've got a steam mill, steam-driven mill. We've got some churches and schools here, kind of that big intersection right across where the lake crossing is. And then we've got some sawmills, some probably water-driven sawmills here along these larger flowing creeks, Cherry Creek, Meadow Mountain Run. But not a lot, we don't see a lot of little buildings. We don't see any other schools or churches. And again, this was a marshy, kind of swampy area. It was subject to flooding. And, there wasn't a lot of reason for people to settle here long term. It was kind of a way to go through, and you would utilize the resources where you could, but no one was really settling a lot in this area at that time. But the area got some more attention again, kind of in the late 1800s, in the form of fisheries. So Gus DeLauder was a prominent local citizen, and he became the county's first fish commissioner. In this time frame, both Maryland's governor and nationwide, there was a lot of alarm and interest at the decline in natural fisheries. So it is kind of the common story of, we had come into this unspoiled, resource-rich country. People had been taking and using them at will, and they become depleted. And if something isn't done, they just become depleted to exhaustion. So luckily, the governor of Maryland at the time and other officials recognized that there was an importance in preserving the natural resources of fisheries, and they started creating fish commissioners and people to protect these resources. So in 1883, DeLauder and T. Harrison Garrett, so it was one of the sons of Garrett County's namesake, purchased about 1,000 acres on today's Rock Lodge Road and constructed the first, maybe, dam on Deep Creek. So generally about where Cherry Creek enters, they created a dam there on Deep Creek, and it created a lake about a mile long, about a quarter mile wide, according to contemporary accounts. They stocked the lake with a variety of local fish. They planted grass to attract those waterfowl that people like to hunt. They even had some canoes available to rent, and they built a lodge there that people could stay at, rent the canoes, go fishing, go hunting, and kind of the very first, recreational destination at Deep Creek. And this lake was named Lake Cleveland in honor of President Cleveland, who was visiting Deer Park, where he was having his honeymoon, but he made an expedition out to Lake Cleveland, spent an afternoon fishing out there, and DeLauder and Garrett named this lake Lake Cleveland after him. Oop. Come back. There we go. All right. A couple of contemporary accounts of Lake Cleveland. This first one's from the Baltimore Sun in 1889. So again, there were a lot of these, even back then, there were a lot of people who were travel correspondents and hunting and fishing and natural resource, tourists who would write articles for the paper about all these great things going on in Garrett County. This one was a very long article. This was, I think, about 4 columns in the Baltimore Sun describing his, expedition. They took the train to the Glaze Hotel in Oakland and then took a carriage out to Lake Cleveland, and just a lot of great accounts of how great the fishing was, the hospitality, some discussions about the whiskey and how great that was. So, a full-service resort there on Lake Cleveland. The second one is a really intriguing discussion about, a local meeting. This was in the Republican paper in 1890, and photographs taken by W.C. Russell of Baltimore of Lake Cleveland. So it's describing, a string of trout, a boat anchored in the lake, bird's eye view of the lake. So I'd love to see those pictures. I mean, they existed. There are pictures of this lake out. Maybe they probably don't exist anymore, but there were pictures of Lake Cleveland at some point. And then even a talk of Lake Cleveland 2. So Mr. DeLauder bought land, owned the McHenry land out at the, there, and was going to build another Lake Cleveland there, another lake. I don't think he would have named it Lake Cleveland, but that never happened. I never saw anything further about that potential development, but he does mention how successful his first lake was, and that motivated him to try and build a second one. So Lake Cleveland kind of passed from the mention of news. It really didn't. I don't see much past that. Those 1892, those 1890, early 1890 period. You don't see a lot of mentions of Lake Cleveland, so must have just kind of faded out. But in 1892, R.T. Browning, grandson of Meshach Browning, became the fish commissioner. So this was, apparently the job to have back then. And he oversaw the construction of another dam on Deep Creek, and this one's near the site of the current Glendale Bridge. And this one formed Lake Brown. This was named for the current governor of Maryland at the time. And Browning stocked Lake Brown with a variety of fish. But the important thing about Lake Brown was that it was open to the public and is likely the first publicly funded fishing and recreation spot in the state of Maryland. So there may be some ones that are further downstate that may vie for that title. But the important thing is that the recognition of both the natural resource recreation, the fisheries were very important to the state and the county. And Lake Brown got a lot of positive reviews and a lot of was well renowned. So this is similar to the Lake Cleveland discussion. Another travel correspondent from the Republican, but was visiting and wrote a multi-column coverage of Lake Brown and the bounty of the area, the great hunting, the fishing. And I will read this little snippet at the end. In conclusion, let us add that if we had the power, not another tree should be felled in this forest, not another sawmill should be planted, not another tram road or narrow gauge road should be built, and the iron horse should be confined to those roads which have been constructed for his travel. So that's kind of the first person who said, I came here and I don't want anything else to happen now. But, I think we all feel that way. It's like we come here, it's beautiful, and no more development. Another mention of Lake Brown is Getty Browning. Caught, at that time, the record trout measuring 17 inches, and that was in 1900. Now the current record is 18 and a half inches, but I mean that's still was a big trout even for today's standard. And then on the right, one of the first 4th of July kind of formal celebrations on the Lake Brown on July 4th in 1893. So they had a band and refreshments. This map is that 1901 topographical map, and I didn't mention it when we first looked at this map, but at that point it did have the state dam and Lake Brown on that. That's generally about where today's Glendale Bridge is. We've got generally the route of 219 here, and Glendale Road coming along in here. I've never been able to find a map that notes where Lake Cleveland is, but if you kind of follow the descriptions, it would have been dammed around here. Here's Cherry Creek. So the descriptions generally say that it was dammed on Deep Creek around Cherry Creek. So somewhere on this area, probably around here where it gets narrow, would be generally where Lake Cleveland was. But as I said, I've never been able to find a picture of Lake Cleveland or Lake Browning. This is Lake Brown. This is the closest I've ever gotten. Was a picture of the road over the dam, and it's not very interesting, but it is does show that was actually there. There was a road. You can kind of see Narrows Hill here in the back. You can get an idea of where this generally was if you're kind of looking in that same direction. But there was a need, this road was over the dam, and it was, what they used to cross Deep Creek there at that Lake Brown. But by the early 1900s, the mentions of Lake Brown or Lake Cleveland really drop off. So I've never been able to really find out if they were demolished on purpose, if they just kind of washed away, but nothing really mentions their ultimate fate. And in between this period and this early 1900s time is kind of another trough of interest and activity in the Deep Creek area. It's very rarely mentioned in the newspapers. The biggest controversy going on was whether the county would ever pay to rebuild that main bridge. So there was always arguments for and against. Finally, in 1912, the county replaced the bridge, and there was a big celebration and a lot of fanfare. People wanting to be the first to drive across this new bridge. And another interesting character from this era of time in the county was a guy named Hiram Tasker. I've done a whole side presentation on him, and he was kind of a multifaceted guy. But one of his projects was a project to dam the Youghiogheny for hydroelectric power, and then he predicted that Deep Creek would be next. And he did this back in 1911, was his, when he pitched this plan, he pitched the plan to the city of Baltimore saying that the electricity would be so cheap, all you'd have to do is build the power lines from Baltimore to Deep Creek, and you'll have all the electricity you needed. So they declined the project. It kind of fell off into obscurity. But he was prophetic in that the next dam was indeed built over Deep Creek. And 1922 are really kind of the first mentions you start seeing of the current Deep Creek hydroelectric project. But you get a nice view of what McHenry was like in 1910, and I think you can probably really envision where this spot is, right? And the things, so this is a Leo Beachy photograph, one of our county treasures. He took a lot of amazing high quality photographs of the area in the range of 1905 to 1925. Unfortunately, most of them are either around Grantsville or the southern part of the county. Not a lot in this area, and maybe because there wasn't a lot going on. McHenry was essentially this right here. And we have a little general store. You can see there's Standard Gasoline, United States Tire and Tubes. This little thing says Post Office McHenry. This one back here says Caution School Building. Of course, you got Coca-Cola. I couldn't make out some of these other ones. But yeah, I mean, this is, here is where generally here was where today's post office is. And you can see that flat area back there that, if you just painted that blue, would be the lake. But right now, it's just a kind of flat, grassy area back in 1910. And it was pretty quiet until the 1920s when the developers started putting together this plan for the Deep Creek hydroelectric project. And in 1923 was November of 1923 was the first big public hearing of this, where the Maryland Public Service Commission eventually, or very quickly approved this, but they first pitched this project at formally in late 1923. In 1924, in July, the project was already well underway, and by May of 1925, the project was complete. The turbines were switched on for the first time. So it's mind-boggling to me that this project was essentially completed in 2 years. I mean, today, no one would have even broken ground in 2 years on a project this big. But yeah, they moved quickly and got it done, and were successful in doing it. But it wasn't without some hiccups. They definitely tried to shortcut some of these things as much as they could. This is the proposed relocation of roads. So they already had a very good idea of what would flood. And there's some great stories about, how the engineers knew what was going to flood and what wasn't going to flood. And we can get into that maybe in the discussion of the history of the lake itself. But, they needed to reroute this piece of road. This was the original, that main crossing of Deep Creek that we've seen a lot. and they moved that over here in today's location of the 219 bridge. But they were not originally planning to build the Glendale Bridge. So they pitched a plan to just end Glendale here and here and not have that bridge there. And the county very nicely allowed them to build the bridge at their expense if they wanted the project to continue forward. So luckily, because I live right here, so that would be a pretty. And when they were replacing Glendale Bridge, I was around, and it was quite a hassle to go all the way around. So luckily, the county had the foresight to make sure that they did build that bridge. But there were a number of crossings and roads that were condemned, that were never, the bridges weren't built, and the roads just ended, and they are now flooded underneath the lake. And we'll see some of that in the next slide of some of these roads that just, you can, if you look at the map today, you can kind of see where that happens. So if you've got Beckman's Peninsula here, you can kind of see where, the modern day road would have ended, but it did continue and cross the lake there. You've got some of the ones down here on Turkey Neck. That road did continue and crossed Green Glade Run there, but these roads just dead end now at those certain spots. So it's and if you are interested in digging really into that map, I've got a copy of that map over there if you want to check that out after the presentation and really look at where your place is. It's a little tough. The topo map here, the background is from 1901. This is the modern day, so they don't quite line up. You can kind of see the course of Deep Creek doesn't quite line up correctly, but they did a pretty good job for having just transits and levels back in 1901 of knowing where everything was. So just to wrap up, some summary of what Deep Creek was like. It was unusual in terms of a lot of the streams around here. A lot of streams are kind of the rocky, shallow, fast-moving streams. Deep Creek was indeed deep. It was slow-moving, kind of had that, marshy, grassy banks, but it did create that great habitat and atmosphere for hunting, for fishing, and just for enjoying the beauty and natural feeling of the area. And even in the early 1800s, when it was tough to get here, people were coming here specifically for that. And the other interesting thing is that the two previous dams that were on the lake, on Deep Creek, were built solely for recreational use. So unlike today's dam, which had its origins and still operates as a hydroelectric plant, those first two dams were built specifically for creating fisheries, for doing some recreational boating, for hunting, and just for relaxing. So it's interesting that even the late 1800s, that was a focus of getting here, enjoying the area, and getting out on the water. So you'll be able to download all this. You can download this presentation from my website. I have cards over there. You can go over there, get the presentation, and go to all the links if you want to get, look at those maps in detail or look at any of these resources in a lot more detail. But a quick epilogue. Remember the Falls of Deep Creek and the Devil's Castle. I got interested in seeing if I could find out where that was. So here's the dam. Here's this still is Deep Creek. This is a body of water, at least on the maps. So if you kind of look through here, you can kind of see some clues that maybe there is something here that might be worth checking out. This is what's called LIDAR imagery, which is similar to radar. It's kind of an imaging system that uses the reflectivity of certain surfaces. And what's nice is it looks through the trees. So you can see what the rocks look like and the terrain of the surfaces without the trees. So here's the Youghiogheny River. Here is Deep Creek. And you can even see Muddy Creek Falls there. It's very clearly like a cliff there. So if you zoom in here, it's intriguing. There's some features in there that look like they may be worth checking out. They may be kind of waterfall-like features. And then using the property maps, the tax maps that the county maintains, you can see that this area right here is all public land. It's all owned by the DNR. So this is all area that you can go to as a public or private citizen. And just spoiling the lead here, I did find that the Falls of Deep Creek are still there, and the Devil's Castle is still there. So you have to kind of make a very treacherous journey down Deep Creek, kind of following the stream bed. But it's a little tough to see in this picture because the trees are screening it out. But the Devil's Castle really lives up to its name. If you're underneath right here, that is overhanging by about 20 feet, and you really do feel like you need to impend your footsteps to get out of the way. I don't remember what Shriver's prose was, but it's really a very impressive feature. The Falls of Deep Creek are very cool, and it was really cool to take a kind of a now and then picture. The trees are really screening it out a lot, but look at that rock right there on both of these, and it's clearly the same place. So it was very satisfying to get there, and I have a video on getting there if you want to. There's no trail. It's not an easy expedition, but it's doable. Yeah. That's right. But the reason I left that to the end is there's still secrets, there's still stories, and there's still a lot to be told about Deep Creek. And my pitch for the night is Deep Creek Lake is turning 100 next year. And I happen to be the chair of the committee that's going to be celebrating the centennial. So we will be doing a series of events. We'll be doing some projects, and we'd love to have everyone in here involved in any way you can, whether it's sharing stories, photographs, memories. We have some really great events coming up, so we'd love to get you involved. DCL 100 is a website. You can contact us. You can find out more information there, and contact me there if you want to. Check out my website. You can get some maps and all the blog posts and drill down into this as much as you care to. And that's all I have, so thank you very much.